All right, we'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. A great Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, to be able to begin the new Masechta today. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors, to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating our Shimon Drashos this year as a schus for Besoros Tavos Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul Habadim L'Tova Bennett Goldberg, for an aliyah for the neshamas of his parents, Avram Ben Asher Pinchas, Vega Rezel Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that the tefillos of our Kilin of Klal Yisrael will be answered. Shmuel Silber, Dinovitz Le'ilui Nishmas David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Rabbi Yitzchak Aryeh Ben HaChavar Rabbi Yaakov Zichron Livracha, and our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Josh and Malki Rosenblum, Le'ilui Nishmas, Harav Daniel Ben Harav Yehuda Leib Zichron Livracha, the Shiva Vishiva Space Yisrael, who was nifter yesterday. Josh is Rebbe from Eretz Yisrael. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slavin Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah of Kol Chole Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu She'emir Hashem, bring home our hostages, allow our holy soldiers to be successful, Chol Ma'aseh Yedeyim, and Emir Hashem make it a year filled with Besoros Tovos, Geula, and Beracha. Well, so with that, let us begin. Baruch Hashem. What a schos. Welcome back to Sami Esterson. Baruch haba, Baruch haba. Thank you for everything that you did for Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. So I'll say what a schos it is, Baruch Hashem, to be able to begin Mesechas Zevachim together. Oh my gosh, I could barely sleep last night thinking about Kachim, Baruch Hashem. And again, how understand, it's big stuff. Understand that Emir Hashem, when Mashiach comes, we have to know what we're doing. We have to have an idea. As for 2,000 years, this has been so esoteric. And for 2,000 years, ultimately, again, this has kind of been something of the past and maybe some distant future. But we believe with all of our heart that Emir Hashem this year is going to be the year of Geula, and to be able to go to the Beis Hamikdash with our families and know what's going on and know what's happening and know what we're obligated to do and how we have to do it. Ein zechus gedola mizo. Mamish, the greatest zechus one could possibly imagine. So with that, Rabbi say, let's get ready. Let's get ready. Not just learn Daf Yomi, but let's get ready to prepare for Geula. Let's get ready to prepare for the Beis Hamikdash. And Emir Hashem, let's get ready to lose ourselves in the sea of Kiddusha, Emir Hashem, over the coming months and Emir Hashem years. So let's go. Mesechas Zevachim Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Kol Zevachim shenizbechu shelo lishman ksherim. So a fascinating halacha. Any carbon that you offer up shelo lishma. Now, what does it mean shelo lishma? Take a look at Rashi. Kol Zevachim shishku. Also, the nice part is, we're a little bit back to regular-sized pages, a little bit back to regular-sized pages. So, Emir Hashem, those Harias pages were quite intense. So, Baruch Hashem. So, let's look at Rashi. So, one of the great things that we're going to get to do over the course of this Masechta is Emir Hashem really get a categorical understanding of karbanos. So, for example, let's say a person has an olah. An olah, of course, is a carbon that is totally consumed on the mizbeach, versus a shlamim, right? A shlamim is a carbon where part of it is consumed, part of it is eaten by the owners, and part of it ultimately, again, is eaten by the kohanim. So let's say, again, I have to bring an olah, but instead what ends up happening is I have kavana for a shlamim. Now we're going to discuss again kavana when. So let's assume right now that at the time that the animal is being shechted, I have kavana ultimately for a shlamim. So I have the wrong intention by my carbon. So the first thing the Mishnah says, ksherim. Halacha l'may says kasher. So I'll say, watch this. Just understand the tremendous yisod that the Gemara's first line of Maseches Kachim. And what is it saying? What the discussion ultimately, again, when it comes to Kachim, the first intention is intentionality. Intentionality. If you want the life of Kachim, if at the end of the day you want the life of Kiddusha, the most important concept, the most important thing you need is intentionality. A life without intentionality is a life that's not really going where you want it to go. I've quoted this many times, just actually quoted this last night in the Tanya Shir. I think in the Tanya Shir. The Piagetz brings down in Chovas HaTalmidim, not Chovas HaTalmidim, B'nei Machshava Tova, that ultimately it is so important for a person to have a schedule. Piagetz says, do whatever you want. I mean, don't do whatever you want. Right? But go ahead, and spend time with your friends, relax, recreation, learn Torah, have dinner. Do whatever you want to do, but make sure that you have a schedule. Because when you have a schedule, then you live life with intentionality. You live life with direction. So the Gemara saying over here is the ideal is if you want a carbon, if you want kirva, if you want closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you want connection to the Ribbon Shalom, what do you need? You need intentionality. You need intentionality. You have to have focus. But what's the good news? What's the good news? But I didn't have any intentionality. It's okay. Good things could still come without intentionality, but great things can only come with intentionality. So if you want a true kirva, you want a true carbon, at the end of the day, you need intentionality. Okay, but you didn't have it, your carbon could still be kosher. Ella shla'alu bailim l'shem chova. But what's the caveat? The caveat is it's very interesting that the carbon will not count towards the obligation of the owner. So for example, let's say I was obligated, again, we're just going to use terms loosely now without any real depth to it, just by way of illustration. So let's say again in the Mishnah's case, I'm obligated to go ahead and bring an ola. That's my obligation. So now the Mishnah tells me that if I have in mind when I shechted for a shlamim, I'm still yotzei. So what does it mean I'm still yotzei? What does it mean? I should say it's still kosher. Kosher means the carbon is a legitimate carbon, but what? It doesn't satisfy my obligation. So in other words, the carbon itself is not invalidated, but if I was bringing this to satisfy a particular obligation, that does not work. So fascinating idea. So carbon is fit, legitimately fit, but at the end of the day, it does not satisfy my obligation. Next, chutz min ha-pesach v'achatos. So it says fascinating. Now there are two exceptions to this rule. So in general, the Mishnah espouses the rule. You offer up a carbon for the wrong intention, right? For the shalom for the wrong intention, the carbon is kosher, but it doesn't work to satisfy the owner's obligation. There are two exceptions to this rule, where if you offer up a carbon with the wrong intention, the carbon is invalid. What are those two exceptions? Pesach, carbon Pesach, and chatos. Good. So we'll say, so what's going on over here? Rashi says over here, chutz min ha-Pesach v'achatos, first short line, shin psulin ligamre. If you offer up a carbon Pesach, not lishma, if you go ahead and you offer up a chatos, not lishma, the karbanos are entirely invalid. So not only do they not count for the owner's obligation, but ultimately, again, they are not kosher as well. Incredible. So Rabbi Elazar says, Ap ha'asham. Rabbi Elazar says it's not just Pesach and chatos, but we also include an asham. Now, I will say, again, like one of the exciting things that we're going to get to do in Kodshim is really define our carbonic categories. So remember, chatas and an asham are both sin offerings. They're both sin offerings. Obviously, they atone for different things that we'll discuss. So Belazar says, just like a chatas, ultimately, again, if offered up shalom l'shma, is possible, the carbon itself is possible, so too again the same applies with an asham. Ha-Pesach bizmano, v'achatas v'asham b'chol zman. So now the Gemara is something very interesting. When do we say ultimately again that a Pesach and a chatas are invalid? When is that? So Pesach dafka bizmano. Bizmano means again for the carbon Pesach, Erev Pesach, and a chatas and an asham at all times. So we'll say this is very important. Ichatos ultimately, again, is only going to be a carbon Pesach is only going to be invalid if you have wrong intention at the time that a carbon Pesach would normally be offered. Now, I will say, what the Mishnah is operating over here is a very important yisod. A carbon Pesach at its core is what? Is a shlomim. So which is why, again, it's only an Erev Pesach that is called a Pesach. The rest of the year would just be called a Shlamim. So the Gemara is just saying over here that when do we say that a carbon Pesach that is offered up Shalom L'Shma is going to be pasul? That's only when it's offered up Bizmano, i.e. Erev Pesach. A Chatos and an Asham that are offered up without intention are going to be pasul all year round, all the time. Good. So the Gemara goes right. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Ma'achatos ba'achet, va'asham ba'achet. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer is explaining why he includes asham in the category of chatos and pesach. He says, I'll tell you why. A chatos comes because of a sin. Va'asham ba'alchet. And asham also comes for a chet. Ma'chatos psula shelo lishma. Just like a chatos, if you offered up shalom l'shma, again, I will say, remember, what does shalom l'shma mean? For now, we're assuming shalom l'shma means what? Means what? For the wrong purpose, for the wrong designation. right? I brought the chatos, and I had in mind for a shlomim. So the Gemara, so Rabbi will say this, just like a chatos is pashal shelo lishma, afa asham pasal shelo lishma. So too, ultimately, again, an asham is pasal shelo lishma. Incredible. Okay, we'll say. So let's just pause here for just a second. Let's review. What do we have? And remembering, I will say, you're going to see kachim. It's really, it's not complicated. There's just a lot of details that we have to follow along with. Okay, so detail number one. What did the Mishnah teach me? The unwritten rule is offer up every carbon for the right purpose. Okay, this Mishnah doesn't have to say that because that's kind of obvious. What happens if I offered up the carbon for the wrong designation? B'diavad, it is kosher. Tanakama said, however, it does not discharge the obligation of the owner. Tanakama says two exceptions to this rule. What are they? Chatos and Pesach. Pesach and Chatos. However, Pesach is only invalid when offered up on Erev Pesach for the wrong intention. Chatos, all year round. Rabbi Eliezer says it's not just Chatos and Pesach, it's also Asham. Now the Mishnah says, Rabbi Eliezer, why are you including Asham? It's simple. If it's whatever is going to work for a Chatos, or whatever is going to be true for a Chatos, should also be true for an Asham. Why? Because just like Chatos is a sin offering, Asham is a sin offering, and therefore, again, if halacha l'maisa, chatos is going to be invalid when offered up shelo lishma, so too an asham should be invalid if offered up lo lishma. Beautiful. That's the Mishnah. Oh, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi ben Choni says, Hanishchatal l'shem Pesach l'shem chatos psulin. So Yossi ben Choni says that those items, those karbanos that are offered up l'shem Pesach and l'shem chatos are going to be pasul. I will say now what exactly that means. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Hanishchat l'shem Pesach, kol shar Zevachim shenizbuchu biyudalad b'nisan l'shem Pesach, o shenizbuchu l'shem chatos b'chol zman psulin ki hechi de'inhu psulin l'shem achirim. So we'll say essentially Rabbi Yossi ben Choni is saying is like this: the same way that a Pesach or a chatos, if offered up for the wrong designation, are invalid, so the reverse is true also. If on Erev Pesach you offer up another carbon, l'shem carbon Pesach, or during the rest of the year you offer up another carbon, l'shem chatos, that erroneous designation will invalidate those carbonos as well. So we'll say, just understand what just happened over here. According to Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer, in general the rule is, if you offer up carbonos for the wrong designation, the carbon is still kosher, doesn't count for the owners, but ultimately still kosher. Two exceptions to that rule. What are the two exceptions? Chatos and Pesach. But again, just Chatos and Pesach. Yossi ben Choni is coming along and saying the reverse is the same way that Pesach and Chatos, if offered shelo l'shman, are pasul. So too, if on Erev Pesach you offer up another carbon, l'shem Pesach, that carbon is invalidated. And if you offer up another carbon, l'shem chatos, that carbon is invalid. So just the reverse is true as well. Shimon Achi Azariah Omer. I will say this is fascinating. Shimon, the brother of Azariah, said, and I will say a very strange appellation. What does that mean? Shimon ben Azariah? Shimon Achi Azariah, Shimon the brother of Azariah? That's not how the Gemara, that's not how the Mishnah records names. A beautiful Rashi, look at Rashi. Shimon Achi Azariah, this is so beautiful. Al Shem Sha'azariah, Asak B'Pragmatya. Shimon and Azariah were brothers. Shimon was a Talmud Chacham, and Azariah was a businessman. And what did Azariah do? The Sipek Tzarchi Shimon Achiv B'Shashay Osek Batorah. Ultimately, again, Azariah was successful in business, and he supported his brother Shimon in his learning. And what did they do? V'hisnu b'nei, and they made an agreement between the two of them. She'chelek la'Azariah b'schar Talmudo shel Shimon. That ultimately, again, Azariah should get part of the schar, part of the reward for Shimon's learning. Kedamina besota im yitein ish es kolhon beso lo kishimon achi Azariah lefichach nikra al shmo shalamad al yado. So it says very beautiful. Therefore, Shimon is always known as the brother of Azariah. Why? Because Azariah was the one who enabled him through his support, ultimately again to become a great Talmud Chacham. So I say there's a lot of beautiful lessons to be learned over here. Just first of all, I want to point out that if you notice the lesson of Rashi, says over here that when Azariah supported Shimon, hisnu beinein she'chilek la'Azariah. They stipulated between the two of them that part of the schar for the learning should go to Azariah. I will say, so sometimes we go ahead and we say chilek. Chilek means like half. Chilek doesn't have to mean half. Chilek just means a portion. At the end of the day, I will say it would be hard to believe that you get half of the reward for someone's learning just by supporting them. You could get some of the reward, but there are certain things in life where you're only going to get the real measure or the real a significant portion of the reward if you're doing the work yourself. Right? There's only so much reward you could buy. You definitely could purchase a good amount of it, but the lion's share of reward only really comes through dynamic effort. That's number one. Number two, I'll say, what do you see from here? That sometimes in life, it is not about what we do for ourselves, but it's about the greatness that we enable in others. Because think about it, if you enable greatness in others, that becomes a force multiplier. I'm one person. So as one person, there's only so much I could do. But if I try to do my best and I figure out how to enable people and support others, whether it's materially or just emotionally, to be able to become the best version of themselves, then I not only have a chelik in my own accomplishment, but I share a chelik in their accomplishment as well. Sometimes even greater than what you do for yourself is the greatness that ultimately you enable in others. Incredible. So what does Shimon Achi Azariah say? He says, Omer, shachtan l'shem gavoa mehen ksherin, l'shem naruch mehen psulin. So Shimon, the brother of Azariah, has an interesting approach. He says like this: when it comes to making a mistake in designation, he says it all depends on the mistake. If you went ahead and you had erroneous intent for a carbon of higher sanctity, then your carbon is still valid, it's still kosher. If you had in mind for a carbon of lower sanctity, then the carbon is invalid. He gives an example of this, Ketzad. So we'll say again, we're going to very exciting because we're going to define all of these categories. But for our purposes this morning, Kodshei Kadoshim represent karbanos of higher sanctity. So let's say I'm shechting Kodshei Kadoshim, but when I shecht it, I have in mind for Kodshim Kalim. So therefore, I'm having in mind for a lower sanctity carbon. Ultimately, pasul. It's pasul. Kodshim Kadoshim l'sheshachta l'shem Kodshei Kadoshim. Sorry. Kodshim Kalim, Sheshachta L'Shem Kodshei Kadoshim, Kshirim. But if I'm shechting Kodshei Kalim, lower sanctity karbanos, and I have in mind for Kodshei Kadoshim, higher sanctity, then ultimately, again, it's going to be kosher. So I will say, just to kind of plot this on the Mishnah graph over here, what Shimon Achi Azariah is really coming along and modifying the Tanakama a little bit, right? Because the way the Tanakama said it was, if you shecht the carbon Shalol Lishma, for the wrong intention, the carbon is going to be kosher, carbon is fine, it just doesn't count towards the owner's obligation. Two exceptions to that rule, Pesach and Chatas. Rabbi Eliezer, throw in there Asham. Right? So Shimon Achi Azariah is just coming along and saying, no, it really depends a little bit more. What intention did you have for the carbon? If you had an intention for a higher sanctity carbon, when shechting your lower sanctity carbon, then you're right. The carbon is going to be kosher. It doesn't count towards the owner's obligation. But if you had in mind for a lower sanctity carbon, when you are shechting your higher sanctity carbon, then that carbon is going to be invalid. Incredible. So let's go weiter. Habachar. There's just more examples of this. Abachar, firstborn animal, Meiser behema, that ultimately, again, you shecht for the purpose of shlomim, kshirin. Why? Because, again, shechting bachar and meiser for the purpose of shlomim represents, again, an elevation of status. Therefore, the carbon will still be kosher. Shlomim sheshachtan l'shem bachar or l'shem meiser psulin. But at the end of the day, if you go ahead and you have a shlomim and you shecht it for the purpose of bachar or the purpose of meiser, ultimately, again, it will be pasul. Why? Because you've shechted a carbon of higher sanctity for the purposes of something of a lower sanctity, and therefore it will be invalid. I will say, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. I'm finishing our first Mishnah, Maseches Kodshim. Emiras Hashem Mishavizocha, to finish many more together. Gemara. Lama li l'misna ela shelo alu. So we'll say, first thing the Gemara starts with is just a question on the syntax, right? The Mishnah says, Kol hazvachim shnizbechu shelo lishman ksherin. Any carbon that you offered up, not lishma, in other words, not for the designated purpose of the carbon being offered, is kasher ela shelo alu lebailim l'shem chova, except it doesn't count towards the obligation of the owner. Says the Gemara, why do you have to phrase it that way? Lama li l'misna ela shelo alu, listni, v'lo alu lebailim l'shem chova. Just consolidate a little bit. So right, if you look like ela, but shelo alu lebailim l'shem chova, it doesn't count for the owner towards his obligation. Why not just say Velo alu l'baylim l'shem chova. It doesn't count. What do you mean? Ella shalo. Just say velo alu l'baylim l'shem chova. It doesn't count towards the owner for their obligation. That's it. The Gemara says, "Hakamashlan come and teach them the lesson. Hakamashlan l'baylim hu delo alu l'shem chova ava biktusha sayhu kaimi va'asra l'shenu yebehu." So we'll say what it does teach us is as follows. It does not count towards the owner to fulfill their obligation, but the carbon still retains its initial residual kedusha, and therefore halacha l'maisa, you can't make any more deviations in it. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is the first white line towards the bottom. Avavik dusha sayo kaimi va'asur l'shanu yebehu sushinu yachrina lavor echas mishar avodos lechatchil l'shalo l'shma miyom avar v'shina kasha. So, let me give you a simple example over here. Let's say according to the Tanakama, let's just keep it simple. I went ahead and I was offering up a shlamim. And instead I went ahead and I had in mind for a carbon toda, a Thanksgiving offering. Okay, so what's the halacha? Kosher, but what? I obviously have to bring another carbon because I still owe a shlamim. Now, what the Gemara is saying is like this. You might have thought like this. Once I went ahead and I deviated in the intentionality, right? I don't know as I had in mind for a toda. So then I could even deviate in the rest of the avodos. One of the exciting things we're going to talk about, we're going to go through extensively, are the various steps in carbonic service. So I will say, so right, remember again, there's smicha, leaning on certain animals. There's shchita, shechting, kabbalah, receiving of the blood. There's holacha, movement of the blood, right, walking of the blood to the mizbeach, zrika, sprinkling of the blood. So I'm going to thought like this. Once I deviated in the kavana, then it doesn't really make a difference if I deviate in other areas as well. Kamash Malan, the Gemara says, not true. Kamash Malan, the Gemara says, it's true. I messed up. So therefore, again, this carbon, which was supposed to be a shlamim, now had the wrong designation of a toda, which means I have not fulfilled my obligation. But for the rest of the ritual rites and carbonic rites and services, I should maintain the right mindset of a shlamim. Just because I deviated on the front end of this carbon does not allow for future deviation. Now, granted, if I did deviate by other avodos, the carbon is still going to be kosher, but you should still try to maintain the right mindset for the rest of the avodos. Hakamash malan, the bailim hudala al l'shem chova. It's just I had not fulfilled my obligation ultimately again when it comes to my shlamim, ava bikdusha sayo kaimi, but the carbon still retains its original kedusha as a shlamim, and you should not make any more deviations in this carbon. So I'll say a really profound yesod if you think about it. What is Gemara teaching us? That a lot of times in life when we make mistakes, so we kind of assume, oh, well, I messed up anyway. So once I messed up, what's the point of trying to rectify it? It's not true. We mess up in life, but the goal in life, sometimes you can't avoid making a mistake, or I think I can't avoid making a mistake. At least if I can't undo the mistake, the best thing I could do is don't compound it. Don't double down on it. Try to figure out what I could do to extricate myself from the clutches of this mistake now instead of trying to make it worse. That's the Gemara saying. So it's like this. You have an ola that was shechted shlo l'shma. Whatever the case is, I shechted an ola for the purpose of a toda, right? Shlo l'shma. Asr lizrok dama shlo l'shma. See, even though, again, I'm supposed to listen to this, even though I had the wrong intention by shchita, right? So ultimately, again, it was supposed to be an ola, but instead, during shchita, I had in mind for a shlamim. Okay, so now the carbon is still going to be kosher, not going to satisfy my obligation. Make sure that by the ensuing ritual rites, the carbonic rites, that you maintain the right mindset. Therefore, when you do zrika, don't do zrika ultimately again, for the sake of the shlamim. Do zrika for the original ola intention. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Ibais ema svara, vibais ema kra." So this concept that even if I deviated in the original intentionality by, let's say, the shchita, I should not deviate during future aspects of the carbonic service, but I should maintain the right mindset. The Gemara says either this is a svara or it's a pasuk. So the Gemara says, "Ibai same as svara." So what's the svara? So very simple. Mishum deshani bakal hani v'lishni bavalezel. Just because I made one mistake, I should continue to make more mistakes. I was like, what a line! What a line! Just because I messed up once, I should keep on messing up. Just because I've been making the same mistake for 35 years, I should continue to go and make the same mistake for the next 35 years. No, change. Okay, so I made a mistake by the shechita, but again, going forward by the other avodas, I should do the right thing. The other part is by a pasuk. What's the pasuk? Motza svasecha tishmar. Listen to this. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Devarim. Motza svasecha tishmar. Vasisa kasher nadarta lashem elokecha nidava. So the pasuk says, literally translated, Motza svasecha tishmar. Whatever you articulate, whatever you utter, make sure to honor it. Make sure to keep it. Vasisa kasher nadarta lashem elokecha nidava. And you shall do what you vowed to Hashem, your God, a nedava. Now, Bosai, you see the problem in the pasuk, right? The pasuk says, talking about by karbanos, or the application of by karbanos. Whatever you promised to do to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whatever neder you made, fulfill it. But then how does it end off? With a nedava. The Bosai, neder and nedava are two different things. Hi nedava, the Gemara says, so why does the pasuk mention nedava? Amud Beis, nederhu. So I'll say ultimately the subject of the pasuk is kasher nadarta, a neder. So if it's talking about a neder, why are you bringing up nidava at this point? First of all, take a quick look at Rashi. Tap Rashi and Beis Beis. Neder who the ha kasher nadarta ksiv v'yesh chilik bein neder lenedava. There's a distinction between neder and nedava. What's the distinction? So the Gemara says neder da'amar harei alai unedava harei zu. Right. So neder ultimately again is on the gavra. Right, harei alai, I take upon myself, and nidava ultimately again, as I say, this animal should be nidava. So the Gemara is asking, why does the pasuk vacillate between neder and nidava? Rather, what does the pasuk teach me? Incredible. Top line 2b, beis with beis. Ella in kamash nadarta sisi hey neder. So the Gemara is teaching me that if you fulfilled, right, in other words, if you carried through on that which you intended to do, then ultimately, then your offering is a neder. Ve'im lav. And if not, ultimately again, it will be counted as a nedava. Look at Rashi. So in general, that's saying this is exactly our principle. That Allah again, if let's say I had an obligation to bring a carbon, but when I offered it, I had in mind for the wrong type of carbon. So what's the halacha? The carbon is kosher. So in other words, so to speak, it becomes like a nedava. I'm offering up a carbon. It doesn't count towards my obligation, but I'm offering up a carbon. Unedava mishari l'shanuyebe. And I will say, but even as an nedava, ultimately again, are you allowed to go ahead and make changes in the designation of a nedava? And the answer is no. What do you see from here? That Allah say, even if you made a change in the designation of the carbon, you should not make subsequent changes during the ensuing rituals and rites. Look at Rashi. And therefore, since the Torah calls this misdesignated carbon a nedava, it tells you that even though you made a mistake on the front end, don't continue to have shalom lishma intentions the rest of the way. Incredible. So Rabbi said to Papa, it's great Gemara. Lo havis kaban ba'arta betchuma de becharmach. So listen to this. So Rabbi said to Papa, oh Papa, did you miss a night last night? You were not with us. You were not with us in the tchum of becharmach. Derami, which is a place, right? Derami, tchum means like the boundary, and Beicharmach is the place. Derami, Rava, Mili, Ma'alyasa, Adadi, Vishani Lahu. Because Rava was contrasting, right? He was going ahead and talking about all different kinds of things, raising all different kinds of contradictions, and he resolved it. So also there's something so beautiful, right? Papa Ravina said, "Oh, did you miss a matzah last night? You missed out." Instead of say, everything depends on who your friends are and who you hang out with, right? In terms of what you consider a good night, right? Why do you consider something that you tell your friends, "Oh, did you miss out?" So at least Ravina and Papa, "Oh, did you miss out?" Mamish. Rava was on fire. Right? He was mamish going ahead and spitting out questions and contradictions and resolving everything. So my mili mal yasa. So obviously you could imagine, right? So Rav Papa has a lot of FOMO over here. So Rav Papa says, no, tell me what happened, right? Give me something. My mili mal yasa. So Tanan, he taught us the following. So we'll say, according to our Mishnah, all karbanos that are offered up shalol lishma. So watch this. Taima this shalol lishman. Now, interestingly enough, Rabbi say, what is happening in the Mishnah? So again, let's just take a simple case. I have an obligation ultimately again to bring a shlamim. And what am I doing? At the time of the shechita, I have in mind that it should be l'shem ola. I'm actively having in mind the wrong carbonic designation. Okay, so good news and bad news. What's the good news? Carbon is kosher. Bad news? I still have to bring another shlamim. Didn't count towards my obligation. Now let's say, here's what's interesting. Hastama alu l'bayil m'shem chova. What about the following case? What about if, let's say again, I'm obligated to bring a shlamim, and at the time of the carbon, I had no intention. Time of the shechita, I didn't have any intention. Like I'm bringing carbon, I did. So in other words, what's the good news? The good news is I didn't have intention for the wrong carbon. What's the bad news or other news is I also didn't have explicit intent to bring a shlamim. So Rava posited that such a carbon is kosher and counts towards my obligation. Why? Stama alu l'baylim. So the Gemara says, Alma stama nami kilishman dami. What was Rava's diuk? Rava's diuk was that in the Mishnah, the problematic case was when you have in mind ultimately again for the wrong. Slichas is 20 or 25? 25. Good. So I'll say, so again, my wrong. When is the carbon compromised? When I have in mind for the wrong type of carbon. Right? So I have to bring a shlamim. I had in mind for an ola. That's when the carbon is compromised. But Rava's inference from the Mishnah, the Mishnah was, but if you just have no intention. So I'm bringing a carbon. So again, I'm bringing it obviously because I had to bring a shlamim. But at the time of the shechita, I didn't have any intention. That works. When I say that works is the carbon is kosher and it fulfills my obligation. What do you see from here? Alma stama nami kilishman dami. Because we both say stama, which means now stama essentially means no specific intent. No specific intent essentially counts as specific intent. In other words, as long as you don't have erroneous intent, the carbon is considered to be offered up lishma. Fascinating. Or many of the Gemara is the kasha. 1 second. Kolaget shenichtav shalol l'shem isha pasol ustama nami pasol. But we contrast this with get. We'll say, what's the halacha with get? Any get that was not written for the purpose of a particular woman. We'll say, let's say again, Ruvain goes into the Svarim store, and he says, listen, I'm divorcing my wife Rachel, and so great, you know what? We'll save you a little bit of time. We have some pre-filled gittin, right? We find a Ruvain and a Leah over here, Ruvain and a Rachel. They find the pre-form, right? And it's there. It's Ruvain and Rachel. Obviously, it doesn't work, right? Why doesn't it work? Because it has to be Lishma. So the Gemara says, Ustama nami pasal. What happens if the Sofer ultimately, again, didn't write it for the wrong woman, he just wrote it just stam. Such a get is going to be pasal also. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, so what we'll call no intention is considered to be negative intention. So what's going on? V'shani, the Gemara says, no, we resolve that. Zevachim bistam l'shman obdim, isha bistam lav l'gerish nomedes. You can't compare those two cases, I will say. Right? In general, a married woman, her chazaka is that she's married. Gerishin represents a tremendous change in what we'll call the life equilibrium. That requires active lishma. In general, if I designate a carbon as a shlom and I'm bringing it, so the default is I've designated it. Remember again, I've designated it, I'm bringing it. So what's the default? The default is that it's for shlomim. As long as I don't change the default, we're good to go. Right? So in other words, so the case is just fundamentally different, Rabbi Pazit. So the Gemara says, Uzvachim b'stomach sheminalan. But from where do you know that if you offer up a carbon without specific intent, that the carbon is going to be kosher? Where do you know that from? So the Gemara says, Ilema meha. Perhaps you learn it from here. Meha. Isnan. So ultimately, we'll say, so again, maybe it's our Mishnah. Right? Because again, remember, look how our Mishnah is phrased. All karbanos that were offered up shelo lishman. Shalom Lishman. So what does that mean? Again, what's the problem over here? They're being offered up for the wrong designation. That's when ultimately, again, they're compromised. Velo katani shelo nizbechu lishman. Now, interesting, right? If the Mishnah wanted to teach us that even stam is problematic, then there would have been a better way to write it. How should it have said? Kol hazvachim, shelo nizbechu lishman. If it wasn't offered lishma, then ultimately it's kasher below Allah l'baylim. That would have told me that even no intent is still problematic. The fact that it says kol hazvachim, ultimately kol hazvachim shnizbechu shelo lishman indicates to us wrong intention is what compromises the carbon. No intention does not. No intention does not. The Gemara says, Gabe get nami haktani, kol get shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasel. Velo katani shelo nichtav l'shem isha pasel. Here's the problem. By gittin, we have that same verbiage as well. And yet by gittin, we know that's not the halacha. Right? By gittin, we know the halacha is ultimately that what? That shelo l'shma, right? Or even stam is going to be problematic. Elameha. Rather, the Gemara says, we learn from here. This nan. Keitzav l'shman v'shelo l'shman. So the Mishnah says, give me an example of l'shman and shelo l'shman. What's the example of that case? So the Gemara says, l'shem pesach or l'shem shlamim. Right, so for example, again, the case would be, let's say again, I'm offering up a carbon pesach, or no, right? And instead, I have in mind for shlamim. So the Gemara says, taima da'amar l'shem pesach or l'shem shlamim. Now, the reason ultimately, again, that this is a case of shelo l'shma is why? Because you actively have in mind for two distinct designations. Ha l'shem pesach ustama kasher. Now, I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, it's not the best example of carbon pesach, because carbon pesach was one of the examples that Tanna Kama said it messes up everything, but don't worry about that right now. So the Gemara says as follows. What do you notice, Amir? When do we say that a change of intention impacts the carbon? Only when there is an active change of designation. But Lamais again, so first of all, it was supposed to be a Pesach, but I had in mind for a Shlamim, or a Shlamim had in mind for Pesach. But again, what we can infer from here is that what? Halashem Pesach Ustama. But ultimately, again, if the intention was first a Pesach and then changed to just a nondescript intention, kasher. Alma staman kilishman dami. Therefore, what do you see from here? That no intention, right, or what we call a stam intention, ultimately, again, is the same as a lishma intention. Or stated otherwise, the only time you compromise the carbon is when you actively have in mind for a different carbonic designation. But when halacha l'maisa, you just have stam, pariv, right? No specific intent, the carbon is still going to be kosher. Dilma shani, so maybe it's different over there. Why? Damar, maybe carbonos are different. Damar, kala osa al das rishona hu osa. So maybe it's different over there because, for example, if let's say you say l'shem pesach, and then you don't have any intentionality afterwards, that's okay. Why? Because l'maisa, since I said l'shem pesach on the outset, that sets the tone. And even if there's no specific intent the rest of the way forward, that's okay, because I've created the intentionality tone. Ella, we'll say one more line and we'll stop. Ella means seifa, rather look at the end of that price. Seifa, shalol v'shman u-lishman. What's an example of shalol v'shman l'shma? L'shem shlam u-l'shem pesach. You started off by saying l'shem pesach, shlam, and then you switched to l'shem pesach. Taimadam l'shem shlam u-l'shem pesach. So the reason ultimately why the carbon is compromised is because you have two actively different intentions. Hastama, or l'shem pesach kosher, but ultimately, again, if it was stam, no intention, then l'shem pesach would be kosher. Dilma shani hasa, maybe that's different. Why? The amar yochiach sofa al tchilaso. Now, also maybe it's different because maybe there's retroactive clarification. Since at the end you had in mind for the right carbon, that shows that from the beginning you had the right intentionality. Inami, ID de tana lishman shlo lishman tana nami shalol lishman ulishman. Rather, again, the Gemara just says, or perhaps we're just bringing out this other case in order to maintain a sense of symmetry. So we'll say we're going to stop over for today. So the Gemara is going to get to the conclusive proof tomorrow. So again, remember, what's our open question? Here's what we know from our Mishnah. If I have wrong intention by the carbon, so leaving aside chatas, asham, and pesach, the carbon is kosher, but ultimately, again, does not count towards the owner. The Gemara now says, but what happens if I just have blank intention, stam intention? Does that compromise the carbon? The Gemara, so now both the Gemara is trying to answer that. We're trying to answer it a couple of times, didn't work. Amir Hashem, stay tuned. Answer first thing tomorrow morning. Shkar Chavosai. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.